It's great to be here with you. You need to know that my old aide when I was the Army Chief of Staff is Colonel Dan Hampton. And he called in his last chit because I owe him a lot. And he asked me to come, and I said I'd be more than glad to come and be able to do this. Now, you need to know that he's not as good an aide as he used to be, because I had to call him this morning and ask him what building I was going to today. But anyway, nice to be here with you. As Ray mentioned, I have done a lot of work in retirement on talking about leadership to businesses and at business schools around the United States. And what I found is the principles of strategic leadership that I learned as the commander in Iraq and as the commander, as the Chief of Staff of the United States Army, are pretty much the same general principles that multinational businesses and corporations need to apply. It really comes down to leaders focusing their time and energy on the most important things, the things that will have the highest payoff for their organizations. And so that's what I'd like to talk to you all about today. 4 principles of strategic leadership. And then I think Joyce will come on and she'll take that down to the level of Africa. But I'm going to keep it at the philosophical level here and just really talk about 4 leadership principles. But before I get into that, I'd like to talk just for a moment about the environment that we all live, work, and compete in. And probably 18 months or so ago, I was asked to come to a business school in North Carolina, just south of here. And they said, "General, will you talk about leading in a VUCA environment?" VUCA. And I said, "Of course, Dean, I'd be glad to." And I hung up, and then I Googled VUCA. And I was almost embarrassed to find that VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, was a term that was coined by the U.S. Army War College in the late 1990s to describe what the world would look like after the demise of the Soviet Union. Volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And when you just think about your day-to-day job, do things change? Change quickly and often for reasons beyond your control? It's a volatile environment. But whenever you start a new project, is the outcome uncertain? I can tell you that the only project that I've started in the last 10 years that the outcome was certain was when I cut my grass for the first time after I retired. Complexity. When you get ready to make a decision, do you find that you have to deal with multiple and competing internal and external variables? And ambiguous. You find you're confronted by people looking at the same event and coming up with very different interpretations and different meanings. Nothing is easy any place in the world these days. Our environment is much more VUCA than it was when I entered the Army, certainly 40 years ago. But that's the environment that we operate in. And these principles that I will share with you this morning, I believe it will allow leaders to lead effectively in that VUCA world. All right? Now, 4 principles. First, and these might seem pretty simple, but like anything else, there's a lot behind them. First, leaders at the strategic level need to focus their time and energy in the right places. And I'm sure this never happens in your country, but I found that I had a lot of Army generals who kept looking down inside their organization and doing the job they just came from. rather than focusing on the really important things. And I'll talk about what I think those things are. Secondly, in the security business, both military and civilian leaders need to work to build a strong civil-military team. And the responsibility is on both sides. It's a relationship. And it takes two to tango. I actually teach a course, as Ray said here, at the University of Denver, a graduate school, on civil-military relations during war. And I use 3 20th century case studies and 2 21st century case studies. And they're primarily American case studies. And I do Marshall and Roosevelt, which we look at as the gold standard for effective civil-military relations. I looked at MacArthur and Truman, in which the President of the United States fires a field commander. That one didn't turn out too well. And I look at Vietnam, where the President of the United States never clearly describes to his military leaders what he wants to accomplish, and you know the results from that. So build a strong civil-military team. Third, lead with character. And this is a constant struggle. You only have to read the papers to know that within the United States Army, some of our leaders have struggled with character issues over the last decade. But we all, as leaders, civilian and military, need to lead by example. And then lastly, leaders at this level need to take care of themselves. They need to carve time out every day to do the things they need to do to sustain themselves so that they can be physically, mentally, and emotionally fit, so they can deal with the very, very difficult issues that are going to confront them. Okay? So those are the 4 things that I'm going to talk about, and let's get right down to it about focusing your time and energy in the right places. As Chief of Staff of the Army, there were days in the Pentagon where I would shake my head and said, what did I get done today? Where I was just bombarded by so many little insignificant things, or seemingly insignificant things, that I didn't feel like I really accomplished anything. And so I had to carve out time to make sure that I addressed the key issues. And the first thing I would suggest to all of you is that the most important thing any leader can do, civil or military, is to point the way ahead, is to say very clearly and succinctly to their subordinates and to their organization, this is what I want to accomplish. The number one question I asked in Iraq, and the number one question I asked as Chief of Staff of the Army, was what are we really trying to accomplish here? And it sounds like an easy question. But what I found was the higher I got, the harder it was for me to answer that question clearly and succinctly. Yet the higher I got, the more important it was that I answer that question clearly and succinctly. Believe me, nothing got clearer when it left the 4-star headquarters and started trickling down through the many layers of the chain of command. If it wasn't clear coming out of my office, that poor soldier at the bottom didn't have a chance. And so I worked very, very hard to be clear about what I was trying to accomplish. It's especially important in this VUCA world that we live in. What I find is people become flummoxed and confused by the complexity and the ambiguity. And when they get that way, they don't act. And you must act to succeed. And so that's why it's so important to be very clear about what you want to accomplish, the vision. But that's not enough, because once you have that vision, you have to have the how. You have to just as clearly and succinctly articulate how you're going to allocate your available resources and prioritize them to achieve that vision. That's the strategy. And I cannot tell you how many times in these businesses that I work with, I see that they have a strategy, but there's a mismatch between where they put their resources and the strategy. So you have to be crystal clear about what you're trying to accomplish and how you're trying to accomplish it. Now, I'll give you a short example. When I came back from Iraq, I had 60 days to begin framing my vision for my 4-year tenure as Chief of Staff of the Army. When I started, I thought my vision for the Army would be America's Army, an agile, disciplined, warrior team, dominant across the spectrum of 21st century combat. That's what most vision statements that I see sound like. And what I found after spending 4 months going all around the Army was an Army that was really stretched by, at that time, 6 years at war. And the volunteer force that we had built since the 70s was dangerously frayed. And so I came to see the Army as out of balance. It was so weighed down by our current commitments in Iraq and Afghanistan with a force that was too small that we couldn't do the things we knew we needed to do to take care of soldiers and families and to prepare for the future. And so I saw it as out of balance. And what happens when you're out of balance? You get back in balance. And that became the vision for my 4 years. Put the Army back in balance. And I drove that into the Army, into the Department of Defense, and into Congress. They all knew what the Army was doing. And then I looked at there were 4 critical things we needed to do to put the Army back in balance. Sustain our soldiers and families, prepare them for combat, fix them when they came back from combat, and prepare for the future. That became the strategy. Sustain, prepare, reset, and transform. And it had to be that simple and that clear because I had to transmit it and drive it into an organization of 1 million people all around the world. But I did, and 4 years later, the Army was in a fundamentally different and better position. Number one thing, be clear about what you want to accomplish and how you want to accomplish it. Be clear on your vision and your strategy. Second, I find the focus of a strategic leader should be more outside the organization than inside the organization. And what I found is the higher I got, the more the keys to success lay outside the organization, not inside. But I had way too many generals, as I said, that when they got to a senior position, they kept looking down. They kept tinkering with things inside the organization. Once you've set the azimuth with the vision and the strategy, your people should be able to execute that fairly effectively. And I found I needed to focus my efforts outside the organization to set the conditions for the organization's success. What I found was that entailed me building consensus and support among groups of people who didn't work for me, who were outside of my direct control. And for a leader, that takes a lot more energy than it does dealing with subordinates, right? Your subordinates will do what you tell them to do once they understand it. But in Iraq, for example, the people I had to deal with that were outside of my control was the U.S. ambassador. Had to make sure the U.S. ambassador was on board with what I was trying to do. The Iraqi prime minister. He needed to know why I wanted to do what I was doing. The intelligence directors, all those folks that I thought were working for me that weren't, they needed to be on board. And then I had to get the Joint Chiefs of Staff back in Washington on board. So I spent a lot of time building consensus and support so that my strategies would be resourced and supported. And it's a lot harder, it takes a lot more energy from the leader to do that than it does dealing with subordinates. In the Pentagon, I had to deal with the Joint Chiefs again. I had to deal with the Secretary of the Army. I had to deal with the Department of Defense principals. And I had to deal with the Secretary of Defense. All of them had to understand what I needed to do with the Army. A lot of time, but it's worth the effort. And the third place to put your time and effort is looking at the future. And what I found is people are usually so consumed with the day-to-day grind that the leader is the only one looking to the future. So if you're not spending a good part of your time thinking about what's happening in the future, there's no one else in the organization that's doing it. And what I found was, I had to have an aggressive mindset. In Iraq, I called it an offensive mindset. I focused on the enemy, and I was opportunistic. It's really easy in these VUCA environments to get knocked back on your heels. You have to keep driving forward. And then I had to figure out how I could see myself so I knew what was going on in my organization, how I could see my competition, see the enemy, and then how I could see my external environment. So we set up assessment systems to look at all those things. And what I found was the data I got from those assessment processes helped me derive insights that helped me give a better view of the future. And then the second thing leaders I found need to focus on when they're thinking about the future is you need to invest in growing the next generation of leaders. And you are where you are because people recognize that you had some skills and talents. It's payback time. At every level of command, I personally led the leader development program. As Army Chief of Staff, my personal staff went through my schedule and they said, you spend 20% of your time training generals. Generals need help too. But it was worth my investment to do that. So those are the three things that I would tell you that leaders at the strategic level need to focus their intellectual and emotional energy to have the highest payoff for the organization. Focusing your time and energy in the right places. And now I've realized that I have gone way too far, and I'm going to need to stop. And so I'm just going to say a couple of words about the other three principles of leadership. Building that strong civil-military team. As I said, it's a relationship. Both sides need to invest on it. What I found is every time the civilian or military leadership changes out, it's worth it to sit down and have a dialogue, a face-to-face dialogue about how you intend to divide the division of labor. A lot of military folks don't like the idea that civilians give them guidance and direction. My personal view is we're better for it. We're better for civilian oversight. The third principle is leaders at this level need to lead with character. You need to lead by example. Leaders with strong values build strong organizations. Why? Because people look at leaders of character and they know that when the going gets tough, they'll do the right thing. They'll do the right thing for the organization and not for themselves. And that trust that comes from that becomes the glue that binds the organization together. And then lastly, you have to take care of yourself. You have to figure out how to get the right amount of rest, get the right amount of exercise, and get enough quiet time for yourself to think about short-term issues and periodically to think about long-term issues. But that, and I'll stop there. But I think probably the most important message I leave with you is leaders that focus their time and the energy in the right places have the highest payoff for the organization. And you will have to force yourself to find the time to do those important things, or you will be consumed by the day-to-day activities. And with that, I will stop and I will hand the stage over to Joyce, and then we will come back and take questions from everybody. Thank you.